My name is Elaine Mathers. I'm 34 years old. Rip that rank off her. Now." My father's voice cut through the air like a blade right in the middle of the commendation ceremony. For a second, it felt like the whole auditorium stopped breathing. I was standing on the stage, my uniform crisp medals freshly pinned my posture steady. The honor I had worked toward for over a decade was being awarded in front of commanders, peers, mentors, and family. My father, seated in the front row, wearing his old civilian blazer, had said nothing up until that moment. And now he was on his feet, hand-shaking voice thunderous. "She's not a soldier. She's my daughter. I know what she's made of." I didn't move. I didn't flinch. I stood there, eyes forward, heels locked, the soft light catching the silver edge of the citation still in my hand. All I could feel was the weight of the silence. People were watching, waiting for me to shout, cry, collapse, explain. I did none of those things. Then someone stepped forward. Not a peer, not a family member. The most senior officer in the room, and what he did next silenced even the echoes. The room fell into stillness. Some looked away. Others, for the first time, looked up at me like they were seeing something they had missed all along. I stood there in the middle of my own commendation ceremony, and no one in that room knew who I really was. Not yet. But they would, because this wasn't the first time I'd been dismissed. But it just might be the last. Come with me. I'll show you who I became and what happened to the man who thought I was nothing more than his daughter. It's remarkable how quiet a room full of decorated officers can become. After my father's outburst, not a single fork clinked against a plate. No murmurs, no shuffling, just silence sharp, almost physical. I could feel my pulse against my collar steady but alert. My hands didn't tremble. They stayed right where they belonged, one lightly over the other. I didn't look at anyone, not my father, not the master sergeant beside me, not even the row of junior officers who had once trained under me. If they were uncomfortable, they didn't show it, but I could feel their confusion hanging in the air. The general, the one who stepped forward, hadn't spoken yet. His boots made a hollow sound against the stage floor as he approached. Deliberate, measured. My father's breath was still ragged from shouting. I didn't have to look at him to know he was staring at me, daring me to fall apart, hoping maybe that I would break down and save him from further embarrassment. But I've never been one to bleed in public. I stood still. It wasn't pride. It wasn't stubbornness. It was resolve and fatigue. The kind of exhaustion that comes from carrying the same burden too long of being seen only as someone's daughter, never as her own name. My father had always made it clear that I didn't belong in uniform. He tolerated it when I enlisted, ignored it when I promoted, and scoffed silently every time a new ribbon was added to my rack. I used to think silence was better than outright rejection. I don't anymore. It was strange. I should have felt humiliated, and maybe I did, but not in the way everyone thought. It wasn't the shouting. It wasn't the attention. It was the knowledge that after everything I had let him come, I had extended the invitation myself, believing foolishly that maybe this time he'd see me. He had. Just not the way I hoped. The general stopped a few feet away. He didn't turn to my father. He didn't turn to the crowd. He looked only at me. His expression was unreadable, neither stern nor soft, but there was a pause in him, a stillness that didn't feel empty. It felt deliberate, and in that pause I felt it. Something shifted. It wasn't a moment of triumph. It wasn't a reversal, not yet. It was recognition, quiet and unspoken. He didn't say my name. He didn't nod. He simply observed. And that was enough to change the atmosphere in the room. Not dramatically, no gasps, no applause. But I saw it in the slight straightening of postures, in the lowered eyes of my fellow officers who began to question what they'd assumed, in the subtle tension of people who suddenly didn't know where to look. There are many kinds of silence. The one that followed my father's shout was the kind that isolates, but the one that followed the general's pause, it did the opposite. It included me. Eventually, the ceremony continued. My citation was read aloud by a junior aide whose voice trembled just once. No one interrupted again. No one clapped either. It wasn't that kind of moment, but it ended, neatly officially. When it was over, people didn't rush to shake my hand. They didn't form a line for congratulations, but they didn't avoid me either. Most simply passed by, a few offering neutral nods or silent glances. The general never said another word, but as I stepped off the stage, he made a gesture so small I thought I imagined it, 2 fingers to the brim of his cap. A courtesy. Not required, not protocol, but unmistakable. Later that evening, back in my quarters, I took off my dress uniform and laid it on the bed. The metal ribbon sat crooked from the way I had held myself all evening. I didn't fix it. I sat for a long time in silence. There were no tears, only the weight of 1,000 untold things. There was a time when I would have written my father a letter, tried again to explain myself, tried to justify the path I chose the way I lead the decisions I made, tried to remind him of the values he once lived by the ones I carried forward even when he forgot them. But I didn't write. There's nothing left to prove. And yet I knew this wasn't the end. There's a photograph tucked in the back of my second drawer, its worn and fading corners curled from years of careless keeping. My mother's in it, smiling in a way I can no longer remember her doing in real life. She's holding me just a baby then. My father's standing beside her in uniform, his face unreadable even in that frozen moment. I look at that photo sometimes, not to remember but to verify, that we were at some point a family. My mother died when I was 5. I don't remember much, only that the house changed after she was gone. It went quieter, sharper. My father was already a decorated officer by then, deeply respected, methodical, distant. He didn't know how to parent without orders to follow, and there were none. Just a grieving child and a grief-stricken man, both unequipped to reach across the widening space between them. He never hit me, he never yelled, but he also never asked questions, never said I'm proud of you, never said that must be hard. He fed me, clothed me, showed up to school events with military punctuality, but always from the back row, always arms crossed, always leaving as soon as the clapping stopped. As I grew, I tried to shape myself into what I thought he respected. Quiet, precise, resilient. I became exceptional at withholding feelings, complaints, desires. I thought maybe that would be the key. It wasn't. When I told him I'd applied for the ROTC scholarship, he barely blinked. "It's not a game," was all he said. No encouragement, no concern. Just a cold dismissal that I've since learned to translate as fear. I didn't know it then. The years that followed weren't extraordinary, at least not to anyone watching from the outside. I graduated, commissioned, deployed. I learned quickly, followed orders, earned trust. And I kept climbing not because I needed medals, but because I needed purpose. I needed to prove to myself, to him, to anyone that I belonged. Every milestone I sent him a card, a photo, sometimes even a handwritten letter. They were never returned, but never bounced back either. He saw them. I know he did. Once, when I made captain, he sent back a single-word email. Noted. That was more than usual. I don't know what he thought when I took command, when I moved into roles once reserved for men like him, when my name began appearing in briefings and defense publications, in memos circulated among senior ranks. Maybe he was proud, maybe he was angry, or maybe he was nothing. I stopped guessing a long time ago. The truth is, his voice has echoed in my head longer than my own. Every time I hesitated, every time I doubted, it was his voice saying, "You don't belong here." Even when I succeeded, it was never quite enough, because in his world I wasn't built for it. I think that's the part that hurts the most. Not the lack of love, but the absence of belief. Some people say rejection shapes you. I believe them. But I also think silence does worse. It grows inside you like a fog, making you question whether you're invisible or just easy to ignore. Still, I kept moving forward, because I had to. Because somewhere deep inside I believed in the work, in the oath I took, in the people who would follow behind me. Even if he never really saw me, I owed it to myself to not disappear. And I didn't. But the day I sent him that invitation to the commendation ceremony, I thought maybe, just Maybe this would be the time he looked at me and saw more than what he lost, that he would see who I became, not who he feared I'd never be. Instead, he stood up in front of everyone and tried to erase me with one sentence. I don't think I'll ever forget the way his voice sounded in that moment. Not because it broke me, but because it confirmed something I had always suspected: he was never going to see me. But someone else did. The weeks after the ceremony passed like wind through a sealed room. No noise, no clarity, just a slow suffocation under layers of formalities, half-spoken conversations, and silences that didn't need to be explained. Nobody talked about what had happened. No one asked me how I was. No one asked me if I was okay. In the command center, I was still referred to by rank, still handed briefings, still expected to debrief teams and oversee logistics. But there was a stiffness now, something unsaid that lingered like smoke after a controlled burn. I could feel it most in the pauses, the way conversations would falter when I walked in, the way even my closest peers would suddenly remember paperwork that needed filing the moment I entered the room. It was subtle, but I noticed, and I knew. They weren't reacting to my father's words alone. They were reacting to the doubt he voiced aloud, the same doubt many of them had probably whispered in their heads long before. Was I promoted too fast? Was I protected? Was I really leadership material, or just a legacy appointment with a famous last name? And once those questions took root, they spread like mold in the corners of the institution. I didn't respond. I did my job. Exactly as before. I showed up early. I left late. I volunteered for the harder tasks, stayed behind when others stepped back, and never once brought up the ceremony, never mentioned my father, never acknowledged the stairs. But the isolation thickened anyway. The new officers didn't seek me out. The senior ones grew distant, and one by one the small daily affirmations that used to make me feel like part of the team began to vanish. A shared coffee break, a message forwarded with a quiet thought, "You'd want to see this," even just the occasional knock on my door with a request for insight. Gone. People still obeyed my orders. They still respected protocol. But their eyes said something else. She's compromised. She's the one whose father humiliated her. She's not untouchable anymore. I knew I couldn't explain my way out of it. Anything I said would sound defensive, emotional, and that was the worst crime a woman in uniform could commit to feel publicly. So I buried it. I buried it under after-action reports and mission debriefs. I buried it under resilience, and I smiled only enough to keep them from asking. I told myself it would pass, that people forget, that the next operation would reset everything, but nothing resets when trust begins to slip. The worst moment came 3 weeks after the ceremony, when an internal memo circulated about a new overseas training liaison, a position I had lobbied for months earlier, one that perfectly aligned with my experience in field readiness logistics. I was told I was under strong consideration, that the role was practically mine. I wasn't even interviewed. When I asked gently without accusation, the response came with bureaucratic smoothness. Priorities shifted. We needed someone with a clearer public profile. A clearer profile. What they meant was someone whose father hadn't publicly questioned their worth. That night, I sat at my desk long after the base went quiet. I opened the email again, read the sentence over and over. It wasn't just a setback, it was confirmation. I wasn't just being avoided, I was being sidelined, not officially, not on paper, but in all the invisible ways that matter in access, in momentum, in credibility. It would have been easy to walk away, easy to turn in a resignation or request a career transition into a civilian role, or even take an extended leave and call it self-care. But I didn't do any of those things, not yet. Instead, I looked at the wall where my certificates hung, not for validation, but for evidence. Evidence that I had earned this, that I had bled and sacrificed and worked harder than anyone expected me to. And then something inside me shifted, not loudly, not triumphantly, just quietly. I began to see the next move, not to run, but to move strategically, away from the noise, towards something they wouldn't see coming. I didn't break down. That's not how it happened. There was no dramatic moment, no shattered glass, no sobbing in stairwells. That's not my style. That's not how women like me unravel. Instead, it happened in inches, in slow, imperceptible withdrawal. I began speaking less in meetings not out of fear, but out of calculation. I showed up precisely on time, never early, never late. I answered questions but stopped offering insights unless asked. I became efficient, forgettable. It felt safer that way. And in that strange numbness, I started to wonder if maybe my father had been right all along. Maybe I wasn't built for this world. Not because I lacked skill or discipline, I had those, but because I lacked immunity to humiliation. Because somewhere inside I still wanted to be seen, to be understood. And that made me soft, didn't it? That's what his voice whispered anyway. It echoed when I turned down the field command rotation that had once been my dream. It echoed when I started looking into admin roles, low visibility positions where no one questioned your merit because no one looked closely enough to care. I convinced myself it was a smart pivot, that I was choosing peace. But it wasn't peace I was seeking. It was invisibility. And that scared me more than anything. I'd spent my whole life trying to be seen as more than someone's daughter. And now I was willing to erase myself just to avoid more scrutiny that wasn't peace. That was surrender. I remember one night late sitting alone in my quarters with my jacket draped over the back of a chair. I hadn't bothered to hang it up. The insignia glinted faintly in the low light, that subtle shine of silver against navy blue. I stared at it for a long time, not with pride, not with shame, just fatigue. I thought about packing it away, folding it, sealing it in one of those vacuum-tight bags, sliding it into the back of a closet. I thought about drafting a transfer request, not even for a better posting, just something out of the spotlight. Something quiet. Logistics officer at a regional facility. Strategic planning on a non-combat base. Safe. Unremarkable. Invisible. But I didn't move, because something deep down, very deep down, whispered that I wasn't finished. It didn't roar. It didn't command. It just nudged. The same voice that once got me through 22-hour deployments in desert heat. The one that steadied my breathing in blackout drills. The one that reminded me I could make decisions under pressure when lives were at stake. That voice hadn't disappeared. It had just gone quiet under the weight of someone else's disappointment. And I realized then I had been carrying my father's shame like it was mine. But it wasn't. What he did in that ceremony said more about him than about me. And what others chose to do afterward said more about them than about my leadership. But I couldn't change them. I could only decide who I wanted to be in the aftermath. I didn't need a grand gesture. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. But I also wasn't ready to vanish. So instead of submitting a resignation, I did something different. Quiet, unannounced. I submitted a request for reassignment, not downward, not away. Just sideways. A role no one would expect. One that would put me exactly where I needed to be, out of sight for now, but never out of purpose. It wasn't an escape. It was strategy. And for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. Not because things were fixed, but because I'd stopped waiting for validation. The war wasn't over, but I had just chosen my battlefield. There's something liberating about not needing to be understood. It doesn't feel like victory, not at first. It feels like standing still while everyone else rushes ahead louder, shinier, more certain. But eventually, you realize how much energy you save when you stop explaining yourself to people who were never really listening. That's the space I moved into. After I filed my reassignment request, I didn't tell anyone, not even the few colleagues who still treated me with something close to warmth. I kept showing up, completing reports, attending briefings. But inwardly, I had already started walking a different path. The position I requested wasn't glamorous. It wasn't even in my direct line of promotion. But it was strategic. It placed me within a joint task unit focused on conflict stabilization quiet work that required coordination discretion and operational nuance. The kind of assignment that didn't attract press or public ceremonies. The kind of role where value isn't measured by visibility. I arrived at the new outpost 2 months later. No welcoming committee, no grand reintroduction, just a woman with a plain duffel bag walking into a modular office on the edge of a less noticed part of the map. And for the first time in years, I felt still. Not hidden, not sidelined. Still. The team was small, interdisciplinary focused. No one cared about rank so much as results. And no one knew, or if they did, they never mentioned what had happened at the ceremony. There, I wasn't the daughter of Colonel Mathers. I was just Mathers, and slowly that began to feel like enough. I kept my head down. I worked hard. I rebuilt trust not with them, but with myself. The first time someone asked me for guidance in a situation they couldn't solve, I almost hesitated. The second time I answered without thinking. By the fifth or sixth, it became routine. They didn't defer to me because of my rank. They leaned on me because I listened, because I thought 3 moves ahead, because I didn't waste words, because I didn't need to be loud to lead. I started mentoring junior officers not formally, not with structure, just quiet conversations after hours over leftover coffee or cooling ramen. They asked things I once asked myself. Am I really meant for this? How do you lead when they don't take you seriously? What do you do when they doubt you for being different? I never gave them pep talks. Just truth, calm, steady truth. And sometimes silence, because I had learned the most powerful leadership doesn't always come from answers. Sometimes it comes from being willing to sit with the hard questions. And then one day, a request came through from Command a task force forming for an international operations initiative. Not flashy, but high stakes. Multilateral coordination, cultural intelligence, critical response. They were building a new model, and they needed someone with adaptability, tactical experience, and emotional intelligence. My name had been submitted, not by a superior, by a peer. I said yes. And when I showed up at the strategic planning session, I recognized one of the officers from the ceremony. He looked at me like he couldn't quite place where we'd met. Then he did. And I watched his eyes shift not with embarrassment, but with recalibration. He saw something he hadn't before. And this time, he didn't look away. But I didn't let that change me. I wasn't here for recognition. I was here because I chose to be, because I had stopped waiting for rooms to invite me in with applause. I had learned to enter quietly, do the work, and leave footprints that mattered more than claps. When I think back to that day on the stage, my father's voice echoing the room frozen, it no longer feels like the moment everything fell apart. It feels like the moment I stopped needing the wrong people's permission to exist. It didn't happen overnight. But piece by piece, I reclaimed something I hadn't realized I'd given away: my direction, my stillness, my command. It had been a year, 12 months since my father's voice split the air in that auditorium, since I stood still while the room turned to stone, since a senior officer stepped forward and silenced the noise not with words, but with a single gesture I never forgot. I hadn't seen my father since. There had been no phone call, no apology. Just a hollow echo of absence that followed me into my reassignment, then into the task force that later elevated me to liaison status. It didn't sting anymore, not in the sharp way it used to. Now it just felt distant, like a language I used to speak. I hadn't planned on going back to that base, but Command had different plans. There was an honors symposium being hosted in the main auditorium, strategic panels, legacy briefings, a closed-door review of leadership development. They asked me to speak not about combat or field work or even tactical resilience. They wanted me to speak about adaptability, about long-term performance in transitional commands. In short, they wanted me to speak about exactly what I'd lived through. I said yes. I arrived early, walked the halls quietly past portraits of old officers, some of whom I had studied under. Some who had never quite met my eye. I knew the layout, the shadows, the coffee machine that always sputtered, the plaque near the back entrance that always sat slightly crooked. Everything was familiar, but nothing felt the same. My uniform was the same cut, my boots the same make, but my presence had weight now, a different gravity. When I stepped into the green room before my panel, I wasn't surprised to see who had been invited as an observer. Retired Colonel Daniel Mathers, my father. He was seated in the second row of the auditorium when I took the stage. He looked older than I remembered, more weathered, a little heavier in the shoulders, but his posture hadn't changed, still rigid, still proud, still convinced that silence was strength. I didn't look at him directly. I looked past him. I delivered the talk with the same even tone I used in every briefing. I spoke plainly about setbacks, pressure reinvention. I offered no anecdotes about that day. I didn't need to, because the room remembered. I could feel it in the stillness, the way they listened not with performative respect, but with interest, with recognition. I ended my remarks without flair. Just the facts, just the work. As I stepped down from the stage, the commanding officer approached. He shook my hand in front of the entire audience. Then he turned toward my father's row, and he did something no one expected. He raised his hand in formal salute, but not to my father, to me. A full, proper salute. Regulation, sharp, public. A small moment, but it hit like thunder. The room followed suit, not with applause, but with awareness. Heads turned, eyes adjusted. The recalibration was quiet but unmistakable. My father didn't move, not even when I passed within 2 feet of him, but I saw it, the tiny hesitation in his breath, the way he stared at the floor for just a second longer than usual, the crease in his brow he couldn't quite iron out, and that was enough. I didn't need a confrontation. I didn't need closure. What I needed was to leave that room fully whole, and I did. Not because they saluted, not because I had proven anything, but because I had stopped shrinking to fit their story. I didn't speak to my father that day. I didn't need to. Some things are louder in silence, and the room was silent. But this time, not because of shame, because of recognition. And that finally was mine. After the symposium, I didn't rush out. I stayed for the debrief, the private roundtable, the paper exchange with new analysts. I moved through the spaces like I always had present, but not performative. People came up to speak with me, most with questions, a few with respect, 1 or 2 with apologies they didn't have the words for. I accepted all of it with the same calm I'd been cultivating for months. But the real moment, the one I hadn't expected, came later. I was walking toward the officer's lot when a young cadet stopped me. He looked barely 23. Nervous, polished shoes, shaky hands. "Ma'am," he said, trying not to stare at my bars. "I just wanted to say, I read your operations analysis from the Darien campaign. It's on the Academy's required list now." I paused. The Darien campaign had been part of my classified rotation, an embedded civilian military conflict stabilization task force. Few people had access to that report. "Required list?" I asked. He nodded. "For the senior track on interagency coordination. Well, they said you developed the framework Command is now testing across the Pacific Division." I nodded once. "Thank you." He stepped back, awkwardly, saluted, and walked away. And that's when it clicked. The silence had shifted. My name wasn't being spoken because of shame anymore. It was being spoken because it had weight. I wasn't hidden. I was studied. I was being used as a framework. Quietly, but widely. That same week, a security clearance update crossed my desk. Attached was my own personnel file, the one my father once dismissed with a single sentence. It was thicker now. Included in the updates were citations from Joint Operations Behavioral Risk modeling a strategic appointment to a newly formed advisory council on conflict response. Under command status, the classification had been elevated. I was now listed as Commander Strategic Response Integration Provisional Deployment Authority. Commander. It was official. Not ceremonial, not honorary, operational, earned. There was no announcement, no press release, just a line in a file. But I knew my father would see it eventually. Retired officers with his clearance always had a way of finding what they wanted, especially when it came to things they'd once tried to suppress. And when he did, I wondered how it would feel. To read it on a page, to know that I had surpassed him not in rank, but in discipline, in reach, in relevance. I thought about sending him a copy, but then I didn't, because it wasn't for him. It was never about proving anything to him. It was about removing him from the equation entirely. I didn't need him to see me anymore. The world already had, and the world hadn't flinched. The commander who saluted me that day in the auditorium later sent me a one-line message. It simply read, "You carry it well." Always did. I never replied. But I let the message sit in my inbox, not because I needed it, but because it reminded me that sometimes when the world finally sees you for who you are, you don't have to say anything back. You just keep going. I live quietly now, not because I've disappeared, but because I no longer feel the need to announce myself. There's a difference. I wake up before sunrise, no alarms, just the body's rhythm trained by years of morning formations and late-night debriefs. My current post is halfway across the country from the base where everything happened. It's not remote, but it's removed, and that suits me. I oversee a joint strategy cell now, not a large team, but a focused one. Analysts, ops planners, coordination officers. We don't wear name tags. The room isn't full of medals. We're measured by impact, not volume. Every now and then, I catch someone trying to piece together my past. A junior team member hears a rumor, sees an old headline, notices a name match. They ask gently, indirectly, like it's a myth. I let them wonder. I no longer owe anyone my story. I've already lived it. There are no pictures in my office. No family portraits, no reminders of who I was before the work rebuilt me. Not because I'm ashamed, but because that chapter belongs to someone I've outgrown. I never went back to confront my father. There was no need. What would I say? That I became the very thing he said I wasn't. That I wore the uniform longer, led more missions, mentored more people than he ever did. None of that would land. Not really. People like him only understand control, not growth, not change, not the kind of strength that never raises its voice. I've come to accept that some people cannot love you unless you remain smaller than their pride, and I stopped trying to fit inside those expectations a long time ago. The funny thing is, I don't hate him. I don't even resent him. What he did at that ceremony was brutal, yes, public, shaming, but in a strange way, it set something free. It pulled the final illusion out from under me that his approval was still the key to my legitimacy. Once that illusion was gone, I was lighter, sharper, unapologetically my own. Now, when new cadets come to my office, unsure, uncertain, carrying the weight of parents who doubt them partners, who diminish them commanders, who overlook them, I listen. And when they ask, "How did you do it?" I say silently, but thoroughly. Then I hand them the right files. I recommend the hard rotations. I watch them grow, and I never mention my past unless it serves them. Because it's not about me anymore. It never really was. I still wear the uniform, but I don't wear the pain. I wear the patience, the grit, the clarity, the knowledge that I've walked through rooms built to silence me, and I didn't just survive. I recalibrated them. And if there's one thing I've learned from all of it, it's this. When they don't give you a seat in the room, you don't break the door. You build something stronger, quieter, smarter. And one day they realize they're standing in your command center.